Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Fuhr. I'm the sales director for Sci-Fi Systems. And today we're going to do a podcast on the emerging European markets for cannabis. We have with us two experts in the field of both economics and law internationally. We have Beau Whitney, who is the founder of Whitney Economics, located in Portland, Oregon. Beau's been in the business for over a decade, making economic forecasts in the cannabis business. And then we have Mariana Larrea, who is joining us from Mexico City. And Mariana is the founder of MLA Legal and Consulting Boutique, located in Mexico City. So thank you, Mariana, for joining us from so far away. It's worth mentioning that both of them just came back from a conference last week in Iceland. They're true global travelers. And I'll start up with you, Mariana. What was the number one or two big points you walked away from that you learned when you were in Iceland?
Well, I think the most important is that we are testifying how the medical industry is popping up around the world. Beau and I have been speaking for now maybe 3 years in different conferences, in a lot of panels together and not together, and always learning from his economics and his numbers. And I think the most relevant thing for me in Iceland is to see how the industry pops, how it comes from the need of the patients and the people who is looking for those solutions, but at the end replies and makes a big sound through the industry, through the authorities, through the companies, through is making this happen, right? It's really funny to arrive to this isolated Iceland, literally, where you figure out how consumers in their own area, they figure it out. How I was also, the second thing that maybe amazed me more is the use of the geothermal energy for the growth, and how they figure it out to use their own elements to create their own flowers and their own plants. I can't say extractions, of course they are not on that point, but since the flower, since analyzing and seeing and understanding the flower, you can see. So it's pretty amazing and fascinating to talk with them, to understand how they've been going through the stigmas in their businesses. We went to this kind of dispensary cannabis shop, which is really in downtown, one street of downtown, really close touristic area, and how people make the industry to happen. So that is amazing. Also, of course, the opportunity to be there, to share, to learn, to say, hey, people, example, let's see what's happening, right? We were in Iceland, but Beau was a little bit earlier in France, which we are 1 year after the program of the 5 studies of medical cannabis started, and then we are awaiting as well in Spain just happened this week,
Right.
so they are popping, different countries are popping in the medical cannabis industry, and it's interesting for us to be on tune, because it's a global industry that is going to represent these benefits to all,
Right.
and more
Right.
with you guys in the rescheduling that is coming, right? So let's see if that benefits, of course.
One thing I just wanted to supplement that a little bit. One thing I found is we can present a lot of economic impact data. We can present a lot of data on jobs and supply and demand and all these things. But what it really comes down to are these human elements. When somebody has a story that's really compelling, it can really make such a significant impact on the movement or the reform within these different countries. There's stories from the UK, there's stories from Iceland, from France, from Germany, all over the place, and they're really, really making a difference. And so bringing in the human element and then supplementing it with the numbers seems to have been a perfect approach.
Yeah.
Beau, I was going to ask you if you could shed a little light on your trip to France. What transposed? What did you learn when you were there 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, so this is the second time I've spoken at the Science in the City International Cannabis Conference. It's a medical conference. And last year when I spoke, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the pilot program should be continued. And there was a change in the government. And so there was all sorts of discussions around that. And they really wanted to focus in on the pilot program and the medical benefits. Fast forward a year, now the medical program has been expanded beyond the pilot program. They're in this transition period from the pilot program and then developing and deploying the rules for the expanded medical program. But in this, what I presented this year was about the economic impact that this expansion would have. And there's a couple of data points that I found interesting. Overall, every year, the French government spends about 3 billion euro on prescription drugs for for pain, for anxiety and inflammation. By deploying a legal medical cannabis program in France, there would be a cost savings to the government of about 10% or 300 million euro. And that's pretty significant. And it's all predicated on whether or not the government allows for insurance reimbursement. Without insurance reimbursement, there'll be less of an incentive to pay out of pocket. But with the insurance reimbursement, then there'll be greater participation in the program. And it looks like as though it'll go from less than 3,000 medical patients in the pilot program to over 300,000 to 800,000 medical patients once it's fully implemented over the next decade or so.
That's a huge change. I had read recently that France is the leading consumer of cannabis in Europe, although it's illegal there technically, and that over 20%, like I seem, does 22% sound right to you, Beau, for consumption rate in France?
Yeah, the numbers are a little bit dynamic because a lot of these numbers come from either EU surveys or UN surveys. And so, and they're done infrequently. And so, and a lot of the resistance in these surveys or the suppression of the numbers, the participation comes from the fact that somebody says, "Hi, I'm from the government. Do you smoke weed?" You know? And so there's a reluctance to participate in these surveys. But what we're seeing is between 15 and 25% consumer usage in France, a majority of which, like 99% of which, is supported via the unregulated market.
Right, right.
And
well, that's
also,
amazing. I'm sorry. Go on, Mariana.
and no, sorry, just an addition here. Also, a social fact. I don't know, Beau, what's your opinion on this? Socially, in France, you feel that the stigma is much more stronger, even though they are the number one consumer in all Europe. It's not easy socially to speak about it. It's not well recognized, said, and we like it or not, the acceptance or not acceptance of society is a really influential element in the regulation and how is the development of those programs. And that also concerning side is when the understanding of the medical program and what they are doing right now mixes with the recreational side, because then you have examples as Germany, where they were struggling a few months ago about the telemedicine, and if they are going to ban the telemedicine way to order flower, because recreational consumers were using the medical platform for recreational purposes and letting medical patients without flower, or at least not the same quality of flower, etc. So these all social effects are going to imply for good or for bad. And I don't know, maybe Beau has numbers and comments regarding the Germany example, because I think it's a really pretty clear example of opening regulation, but a lack of maybe understanding from the stigma side of the society. the
Right.
society needs more information regarding these programs and regarding why this is happening, to mix it with the stigma of the recreational. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny, in the 14 years I've been in this business, I've always felt that when a market transitions to a legal medical market, where legal licensed dispensaries open up, that's the beginning of the change in a
Mhm.
society's stigma. I think that's when people start to see it's not as bad, as they thought it was. And in researching a new article I'm working on, I was shocked that the largest consumer of cannabis is India. The largest exporter up until just last year of cannabis was the UK. Now Canada's since taken that number over, but these are cultures where cannabis is illegal, and yet it's still growing. Which brings me to a question for you, Mariana. From a regulatory standpoint, what are you seeing unfolding in the EU from a regulatory standpoint, both in the medical and second part to that is, what countries do you see after Germany going recreational?
Well, what I see is that everyone is regulating, number one, in accordance of the local or the federal way in each country. It's funny when I think in Europe and different countries and the states, different states, but so here are countries. So example, let's talk about Switzerland is has this particular model, which is the personalized compounding, right? And it's the unique country with now Denmark that are executing this way of dosifying cannabis. Switzerland is running this program and this way to give access to medical cannabis in a particular way because they are the number one country in pharma laboratories, and they have all the technology and they have everything they need to offer a patient personalized medicine right now, which is not going to happen in other country, example like Spain, that is going to starting with a regulation, right? So each one is learning from what they have, but I don't see that they are really putting attention on the global interface to develop their markets first in a local federal way, yes, but with an understanding that this is a global market. You need the global market. We need the flower of the other country because they are on top of us with technology. Canada, example, with a medical flower, right? Sending this flower to Australia and other countries. Then we will need the experience of countries as Switzerland that is already running the dosified personalized medicine. And then we will need experience of other countries with the seeds, right? So we need other countries, and this needs to be understood when you regulate. But of course, government are not seeing our industry as global. They just are worried for the political, local, federal problems, public
Right.
health. And the thing here is that all governments are worried about the same thing: sanitary control. That is what they need to have on control: sanitary control, which means security, quality, and efficacy, right? All governments are going to look for that. So the question is, if all governments are we looking for the same thing, why we can start building a more global, homologized framework of operations? I'm not talking about regulations, but operations that helps the whole change to be built. I'm talking in an utopical way. I know, I understand this. This is not how it's going to work. But I mean, if we just being more open to understand definitions, understand other markets, and how to take advantage of those other markets to your own market, then we will be more further than when we are today. But
Right.
we're still educating people and governments regarding that, and that's why we are all around the world.
Well,
You know,
that's what's.
the
Oh, I'm sorry. Go on, Beau.
the top 4 or 5 countries in terms of consumption are France and Italy, Spain, Germany, and the UK. And each one of these countries are approaching cannabis regulation differently. And some are more comfortable with taking a pharma approach. Others are trying to funnel it through the medical programs, like in Germany. And then others are still trying to get their legs around them. So, what I've found is that in terms of, states on the frontier, I think Mariana is absolutely right with Switzerland. They had a pilot program and now they're expanding it. I think because of proximity to Germany, I think the Czech Republic has a lot going on, as does Poland. There's a huge percentage of cannabis usage in Poland. And they also have a lot of technological advances in the hemp industry as well. UK is a huge market. And it's just more a matter of whether or not you can destigmatize the medical aspects of that in the UK in order to proliferate it throughout the medical system.
Right. Well, that actually was going to lead me to my next question, Beau. And after spending the last couple of years in Germany, going to ICBC, two things stood out to me. One was that they've still continued their ban on extracts, which certainly as an extraction company, he troubles us. We wanted to add a quick update in the middle of this podcast that we just shot the week before last, because we've just been informed that Germany, which is the largest recreational cannabis market in the EU, has just announced they are allowing concentrates, which up until now they haven't. So not only are people starting to make rosin there, but extractors in Canada are starting to get ready to export product to that market. So there'll be a lot more news to come on this, but I can tell you we at Sci-Fi Systems are very excited. And now back to the show. But the other is that people really like smoking weed there. They enjoy their product. And yet I don't sense that Germany has any desire to start licensing grows and labs the same way tobacco. They don't grow their own tobacco. They import everything. And my question to you, Beau, is how are you seeing the export market evolving worldwide over the next, say, 5 years or 10 years? And where's the EU going to play into that?
Well, the way that Germany used to be, now Germany, they have a history of smoking cigarettes. They love smoking things. And so it doesn't surprise me that there's a flower dominant market. And that's typically the case until there's more delivery mechanisms deployed throughout the system. But with Germany, it used to be that they had these little tenders that allowed local growers to grow, but within very limited amounts. And then whatever was not sold into the marketplace through these local German suppliers, then the rest was covered by imports. And that's, to me, is a very logical model, because you don't get too far out over your skis on the domestic production. And then you can have your burst capacity, if you will, from imports from other countries. They changed that slightly, and they did these cultivation clubs. And so they increased the capacity. We did an analysis of that over the last couple of years. And it was starting to become, assuming that they deploy a lot of them, starting to become a lot of supply in the system through just these cultivation clubs. Now, also, everybody and their brother and their sister and their cousin wants to export to Germany. And so you've got countries like Canada exporting, Portugal exporting, Israel, even North Macedonia. I mean, people don't even know where North Macedonia is on a map, but yet they're exporting into Germany. And so my concern about those exports and targeting one particular market was that eventually you'd import too much and then you'd oversaturate the market and then prices would decline. And that's what we're starting to see now. I think Germany just recently announced that they're putting a pause on all flower imports because they have so much supply. And when you have oversupply, you have declining prices, and then that's not good for the local operators and local business. It's great for the consumers, but it's not a way to have a sustainable, healthy industry in the long run.
Right. Yep, I agree. Of course, I have a theory that the way legal markets beat the black market is simple. They just need a price that's lower. And there's a lot that goes along with that with the legal markets. There's the licensing, there's the security, but there's the centerpiece, and this is going to be a question to both of you. The centerpiece I see of cannabis in the European market and really the global market is this concept that Mariana touched on, which is the sanitary processes. And that all revolves around these rules of GMP or EU GMP. And before I ask this question, I'll just briefly frame it that in the US, the GMP standards are only enforced in one state, New York. All of the other states, because it's not a federally legal product, don't enforce GMP standards, which are the standards for all food and pet products to be safe in distribution. My theory is that when cannabis does go through rescheduling, be it in the next 2 years or the next 5 years here in the US, that GMP standard is going to put a lot of people out of business. But my question is, how important do you see these GMP standards being worldwide? What effect do you see them having now on the export market? And what effect do you see them having moving forward?
I think that's a great question. And happy to answer this because I was just last week on Friday, I was in the facility of Bedrocan in Amsterdam. We were there with the CEO, with Jap, Erkenstein. I'm sorry because I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that's the last name correctly, but with Jap. And I have the opportunity to speak with his father, Tajin, last year in Green Tech in the conference. And what I really find fascinating is that the legacy part of each country plays a really important role with the pharma and GMP side, right? Why? Because we were in the facility and they told us all the story, and we walked through the facility and we saw all these complexities that needs to be complied for the GMP, from using the gloves to equipment to how you need to enter in each room, the cleaning of the cameras, everything, and how important for them is the stabilization of the standards and to have everything in the correct dosifying. And they say, we don't care about the color, the flower, the flavonoids, the terpenes, which we know, parentheses, we know those have also therapeutical benefits. We just focus, Mariana, in the same flower, the same concentration of THC, the same GMP, right? And bring to my mind the thought that I never had before regarding the consumers and the patients. Because consumers are always going to look for the flavor, for the flower, for how it looks, or in extractions as well, the terpenes, the flavonoids, the texture, the creamy, everything, right? But patients are really just focused in the dosification. I need to take my pill at 8. I need to take my pill at 4. I don't care if my pill is pink or black or blue. I just know that if I take my pill at 4 and 5, I'm going to be good. And that is GMP. And the understanding of GMP from the side of the pharma, from the side of the patients, from the side of the doctors is really important, because then we will not be confusing or mixing or using recreational flower that is grown with other purposes in your therapeutical treatment. So GMP is always going to be regarding these elements of compliance, and patients and the industry and ourselves, we should be understanding that the medical flower is for patients and it's grown for patients, and the dosification at the end is going to be like that. And I think that's not something we have really clear.
Oh, what you take
one, yeah, it's, for the longest time I've been asking or speaking about how growers in the space, even in post-harvest production, needs to be prepared for these standards for GMP, GAP, GACP, all these standards, so that there's control, there's traceability, and standardization. But recently I've been, and this came up when we were in Iceland, that does GMP really work for everybody? Is it the ultimate solution? And I'm not quite convinced that it is. For example, how do you address GMP in home grow? And how does GMP, with all of its costs and structures, impact small businesses?
Right.
And then how does that impact strain and a medicinal availability for patients?
Right.
And so, there's a need to protect patients and public safety. And I don't think I can't say that I've talked to anybody that's not concerned about public safety, right? Everybody wants public safety, but does the GMP and GAP model fit for everybody? And I'm not convinced that it does.
No,
Okay.
completely. And we were speaking about this, Beau and I, in the same panel in Iceland. And what we were trying to address to the attendants was that GMP and the pharma industry that we are used to is not always going to represent access. And at the end, what government and patients are looking for is access, right? So this should be also needed to be considered. But like example, Mexico, I have all my GMP law regulations for cannabis on site, ready to go. But anything is happening because there is not investment, there is no technology, there is no developments down here, right? So for what I have a GMP law if there is no access to the patients?
Right.
So that difference is really, really important for everyone to see, because then we can integrate both solutions. Of course, pharma, we're going to need it one way or the other, but also patients need access. And that goes through the compounding option, personalized medicine, magistral compounding, like back to basics, back to the boticas.
Well, to
And
your point,
if you have like such high costs in order to implement GMP, then that tends to support bigger producers and bigger commercial operations. And when you have that scenario, then there tends to be a reduction in the amount of strains that are available and the amount of diversity in the offerings. And so that it's going to be a tough balance for countries to make in Europe, to determine how do you balance availability and diversity of strains versus public safety. And that's a model that hasn't necessarily been a riddle that hasn't been solved quite yet.
Right.
Each country is doing things a little bit different. Hopefully they won't make the same mistakes from other countries like the states are doing with every other state here in the United States.
I know in my dealings with the Canadians and the Europeans that there's different GMP in every country. Generally, to your point, Beau, about home grows wouldn't be required to do GMP because they're not commercially marketing their product. But I think, in my perspective, GMP is really about having safe, measured manufacturing processes. Is it expensive? Yes. Is it going to be cost prohibitive to the small groups? Absolutely. Which actually brings a question to you, Beau. What role do you see the big MSOs and now the ISOs? What role are they playing in Europe now, and what role do you see them playing in the next decade?
Well, what the ISOs are doing right now is that they tend to be dominating the export market. And so they're developing the relationships. They have the capital in order to go into these countries like Germany, like South Africa, all over the globe, and set up shop and start establishing their brand. And so their role is going to be the driving market entry and establishing themselves. The key, though, will be whether or not they develop monopolies or oligopolies in those markets to the point where it blocks everybody else out. Because a lot of these countries look at cannabis as a tool for economic development. They want opportunities in the not only to reduce costs in the medical space, but to provide opportunities for jobs and taxes and employment and all that. And so there's the question is, will the ISOs completely block everybody out and dominate these markets, or will there be opportunities? And that's for smaller operators, and that question will be solved via the rules and regulations that are deployed.
We hope. But even if you look, Beau, at the states that tried these social equity licenses, most of these states have been sued by the MSOs because of the inequity in social equity, and they're winning. And the MSOs in those states are taking the lead. It's unfortunate in that way, but
I'm actually speaking on social equity at another conference called MJ BizCon, and so we're working with the MCBA and other social equity groups to have a panel and talk about these issues. What those lawsuits are doing is it's actually hurting the opportunities for the minority communities and not giving them the opportunities that were bestowed upon them through the intention of the legislation. Now, did the legislation get it right? Perhaps not, but at least there was some intention there. And so it's going to be tough to see how all this legislation and how all these lawsuits play out in the near term.
Now, we've been focusing on the EU, but I got to ask Mariana, what's happening in Latin America with cannabis?
What's happening? Well,
Legally,
what is happening?
Legally.
No, things are happening. We have the Brazil conference in November. There's the Argentina conference next week happening. Also, there's an event in Chile, in the Patagonia. So I think in Latin America is popping as well. Example, we have news that in Uruguay is starting to consider CBD to be integrated in the medical model. We know that Uruguay started by the recreational side, and this was the first country decriminalizing cannabis for recreational purposes. But then you see how this continues to pop. Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, we have a similarity that we follow big pharma rules in our own countries. For importing to Brazil, you can import, but of course it's expensive, it's tired, it's a long paperwork to do, but it's happening. Brazil represents one of the biggest markets for patients in Latin America, if Beau doesn't let me lie. But it's a big market for patients. And if they do the things in the correct way, I feel right now they are, as Mexico, 4 years ago when we were fighting for the federal cannabis law. And they are on the point that if they let it go and they don't answer, because the due date was last month regarding the medical market, maybe that is going to be their open, and waiting, which is not good. But also there is a movement that is pushing on there. So let's keep an eye on Brazil. Let's keep an eye on Argentina, because that's other country that is able to import and export. Personally, in the firm, we are working with an Argentine laboratory that is trying to register a medical product in Mexico. And from the other side, in Mexico, we are working with everything. We are in the recreational side. We are developing cannabis clubs. I have 2 clients working already on this. What is a cannabis club? A cannabis club is a legal strategy solution that we find for consumers that can make autogrow in their houses, to have the access to the flower if they don't have the time for growing through this club, which is under a legal figure of a non-profit association, and you don't really pay for the weed. You just can have certain grams of weed per month in this place because you don't have the time to grow it yourself.
Right.
So there is a problem. In Mexico, you can just do auto consumption. So when Mariana is going to grow, come on, she is traveling a lot. So then through this way, is a legal side. I have my permit, the grow has its permit, the coffee shop has its permit, and we do education in the club, which is really needed for consumers and for the youth, right? So we are doing everything in medical, as I say, trying and helping companies to register pharmaceutical products, and in the wellness CBD side, we are developing brands. So that's what's happening in Mexico. Is silent Mexico. I think the political situation right now is more loudly than what is happening in the cannabis industry, but the cannabis industry is happening in Mexico. So that's why I need to go outside and tell this.
You know,
So-
Brazil's an interesting case study because, you know, I gave a speech at a conference that was hosted at the United Nations building in New York. This is a number of years ago. At that time, over 3/4 of the prison population was female due to drug trafficking. Female drug traffickers. Now, what was going on is that at that time, CBD even was illegal. And so they found a solution. The mothers found a solution for their kids, and they were trying to import CBD in order to help their children out. And so they were being arrested and thrown in jail as a result of that. And so, you know, there was over 600,000 women in jail in Brazil. Now, now things have reformed, obviously. And so it's interesting to see, you know, those cases when you're talking about all these mothers in jail just to try to take care of those kids. That's that human element that I was talking about. When you have a story, it's maybe not about the economics. It's not about the job creation or taxes. It's about the mothers that were in jail just to take care of their children. So Brazil's come a long way since that time. And so now they're starting to open up that market. And I think a lot of their reforms are making a lot of sense right now.
Right. I've always had a, oh, I'm sorry,
I'm-
go on, Mariana.
No, that's what Beau and I do all the time. No, and what it will be interesting, Beau, is to see if how they are going to manage the amnestia concept
Yeah.
in law. And that will be a really strong topic then for this group of female, because this is not something that is happening right now. The term marijuana comes from the Marias that bring the cannabis to the States. That is the origins of the name of marijuana. Eran las Marías, las María Juanas, the women trafficking this drug. This happens years and years and years ago. Now we have the representation in the modern times in Brazil. So this is a call to also the society, the industry, to realize that we are always repeating our past.
Yep. Well, I've always had a theory that in order for a market to be the next big cannabis market, it needs to have at least two critical elements. One is they have to have disposable income, and there's not a lot of that to go around in the world, unfortunately. And the second is they need to have a regulatory format that will allow for it. And I guess the third is a society that will allow for it, which brings me to my second to last question I'll ask to Beau, and then I'll have Mariana follow up. And that is, where do you see Asia and Africa playing into the global market in the next decade, if at all?
Well, we just completed a global hemp survey where we mapped out the total number of hectares globally that are allowed and being authorized by these different governments. Every continent was in the top 10 except for Africa, and Nigeria was number 12. So there's a lot of hemp even being grown in Africa. And so you have hemp for industrial purposes and hemp for wellness purposes. But there's a strong cannabis culture, a traditional cannabis culture in Africa. And then, as you rightly mentioned earlier, there's a massive consumer base in India. So I think as the global movement and global reform movement for cannabis evolves, 115 countries now, plus or minus, up from 60 or 65 in 2019. So there's an acceleration of reform globally. But once things become more normalized, then you're going to see strong consumer markets, especially in India and also in China. There's a big market there for cannabis. It's just not talked a lot about because you can't really talk about it in China. So, but I think those are going to be large consumer markets, and Africa will be also this north-south model from an economic perspective. The northern countries are more technologically advanced. The southern countries tend to support the northern countries. I think that dynamic will continue in Africa, where Africa supplies into the northern countries in Europe and North America.
Okay. Interesting.
Yes. Asia is going to be already has been an interesting experiment, right? Thailand taught us a lot, regulating everything and then coming back. I think that's a big lesson to the industry. Also, we have Turkey that they just this last summer as well are moving forward with the regulation of the medical cannabis. They, as well, as I said in the beginning, they are regulating from where they have right now. They just know what the federal law says to the date, and they are struggling, and all the countries are struggling in between the stigma, the social recreational stigma, and the understanding of the medical and the pharma side. So we also, I'm speaking in Japan at the end of the year. So I'm really excited to see how the medical market in Japan is going to be expanded. Of course, the Japanese as well are going to the GMP, and the medical law and the public health concern. So, but also I believe about Asia that they completely do the things in a different way. So I'm sure that we're going to learn from them about how they start to develop all this, right? So it's going to be a good new markets to watch, and maybe in our other episode the next year we can talk about what happened 1 year after this day, right?
From a market value perspective, in terms of dollars or euros, it goes North America, then Europe, and then, Asia, Africa, South America. But when you look at the number of consumers from a market perspective, then there's huge disparity between, there's not that many consumers in the United States and in Europe relative to Asia and Africa. And so it's two different types of markets depending upon how you look at it. But the largest opportunities for cannabis and for hemp, for that matter, are in Asia. And so that's being borne out in all the numbers that I'm running.
Yep. And correct me if I'm wrong, in Northern Africa, Morocco is still the largest producer in terms of metric tons of volume, biomass in the world. They're still growing more weed there than any other country in the world.
I'm not seeing all of that data, but I do know that that between Lebanon, Morocco, and Afghanistan, they're the top 3 largest producers of hash in the world, and the largest exporters thereof.
Yep. One last question for both of you, and I'll start with Mariana and then end with Beau. What signs should we look for in these emerging markets that they're about to go medical or about to transition from medical to recreational? Top 2 signs.
I think the first and most important one is turning the view to the patient. We are developing industries, businesses, commerce, markets, brands, and we're forgetting the patient. Number 2, big pharma is not the same that medical access. So whatever country is trying to regulate should consider that this is going to represent a challenge and integration for their own model. And the third of all, I will look for the definitions. I will be aware a lot of definitions in regulations. I will make a study of which are the best and more fulfilled integrated definitions to put it in my framework. And also, if there is not possibility to homologize the definitions, then to find the exceptions and how those definitions apply in the exceptions, right? Really clear. Cannabis is not the same definition as marijuana in the United States, legal terms, as cannabis in Mexico, as cannabis in Argentina and Brazil, you know?
Mm.
So we need to find a way to protect the legal framework and regulations through exceptions or to trying to integrate complete definitions. And
Okay.
for all, standards, GMP, recreational, cannabis clubs, and speaking all.
Beau, what are the signs you look for in a market that's about to go either medical or trip medical to recreational?
Well, what I look at is the movement within certain geographies. There's generally clusters of reform that takes place in bordering nations. And so when you look at, say, Germany and the Czech Republic and Poland, for example, there's a cluster there. When you're looking at South America, there's a cluster there. When you're looking in states, there are these clusters. And so I tend to look at what are some of these countries doing, and will that have a domino effect in the adjacent countries. And so I take a look at that. And then also I look at the level of stigmatization, but also enforcement by the governments. And so if the governments are easing up a little bit, then it opens the door for more reform.
Yep.
Panama is a good example of that. You know, they were very draconian about their enforcement to the point where on the UN data, that was the lowest consumption rates of practically anywhere in the earth,
Right.
other than like Singapore. But then once the government reformed their view and their stance, then then things started happening there. So I think between clusters and federal laws and the like, federal enforcement, those are the two big indicators that I take a look at.
It's good things to look for. Well, Mariana, Beau, thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy days and travel schedules to join us here. And I look forward to having you back possibly in the future to talk about this some more. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you on our next podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.